In this video, we'll review some of the CSS basics for how to style web pages and make them look professional. We'll talk about how to apply styles with either as inline styles, embedded, or external style sheets. We'll talk about the CSS box model. We'll go over Flexbox. We'll talk about some of the basic selectors, such as type, class, and ID selectors. We'll talk about some of the relational selectors, more specifically the descendant and the direct descendant selectors. We'll talk about some of the CSS properties that you can use to change the background or to change the foreground colors. And then finally, we'll talk about how to use CSS to style text. Okay, so first up, let's talk about how do you apply styling to HTML. Okay, the first way we can do that is with inline styles, right? So we can add a style property to any element and then say, well, okay, what property do you want to set and what value do you want to set it to? So here we're setting this header to a color of blue. Okay, now you can do this, but you really shouldn't, right? And what are some of those reasons that it's maybe not a good idea to apply CSS in this way? Well, there's a few reasons. In general, it's considered really poor style. You really should avoid it at all costs. Writing your CSS as either an embedded style sheet or an external style sheet is always a better idea. One of those reasons is that inline styles have the highest priority, the highest precedence, so you can't override them with a style sheet. If you set something as an inline style, it cannot be overridden. And the fact that it can't be overridden also means that I can't use media queries to change the look of the application based on the viewport size, because it's fixed, right? I can't override it, so I can't make it different with a media query. Same thing when we're talking about theming. If I need to change the theme from maybe a dark theme to a light theme or other sorts of things, I can't change that color, so it prevents me from being able to retheme the site. So for both of those reasons, that goes back to the fact that when you're putting it as an inline style, that is the highest precedence, so I can't overwrite it with something else. And then the last point is that once you start doing this, you start to end up having your styling data scattered across your application and oftentimes duplicated in a lot of different places. So you might say, well, these headers over here are blue, and now you have to go make the headers on another page match that. Well, this becomes really, really a pain as the size of your website grows. The amount of places that you have to go change if you just want to change the color of something becomes pretty enormous if you just want to change one little thing. So it's better to have those styles in a centralized place where you can change them all at once. So the other way that you can apply these styles, one other way, is by using what we call embedded style sheets. Now, embedded style sheets are created by placing them into the head of the document. So they're actually still part of the document, but they only apply to that specific page, right? So embedded style sheets are part of the document. They don't apply to all of the pages on your website. They just apply to that one page, okay? So when we add those, we're going to start it with a style sheet, a style tag, and end it with a closing tag. Within there, we'll put our individual rules. So here, for instance, you'll see my rule says all of the H1s on this page, will they get a color of blue? Okay, so I can write it that way as an embedded style sheet, and that would be preferable over an inline style sheet. But sometimes you have styles that, often you have styles that need to be applied across the entire website. So in that case, it's better to move those into an external style sheet. So in that external style sheet, you'll have that same rule, would be H1, apply to all the H1s, color blue, but in this case, because we've linked up, we'll link up this style sheet to every HTML file. This will then change all of the H1s on the entire website instead of just that one page. Now, typically, we'll put that into a file named main CSS, and we'll put that into a folder named CSS. So that's where you can see the path to it is CSS/main CSS. This is a link tag in order to create this link between the HTML and the CSS file. Since we've broken them up into two files, we now need to add this link to the HTML with a relationship of style sheet. Again, it used to be that you had to put a type there in earlier versions of HTML, but nowadays you don't have to put that type because style sheets are always text CSS nowadays. They're always written in CSS. Okay. So next up is the box model. So we're going to go over that a little bit so you can understand where things fit in there and what are some of the components of the box model as we work through CSS. Okay. So here's kind of a picture of where everything falls. So on the outside layer, you can see that there is the margin, and then as we move further in, you'll see the border, the padding, and then finally the content. So they have this sort of relationship. You'll see that each of those boxes has four sides. So you'll see there's a top, a bottom, a left, and a right. And that's important because remember the margin, the border, and the padding can be set to different values on each of those four sides. Okay. So first of all, what is the margin? Well, what does it do? The margin clears out an area outside of the border, and that margin is always transparent. There's never any content there. It basically prevents elements from being in that window in between. Now, one other thing you need to know about margins are typically collapsed. So if I have top margin from one element here and then bottom margin from this element on top, these two margins, right, they meet. What will happen is you'll take the biggest margin. You don't get the sum of the two margins. The browser will render the biggest one. So let's say the element at the top has 20 pixels of margin and the one on the bottom has 10 pixels of margin. You won't get 30, you'll get 20 because 20 is the bigger number. So that's one thing that you need to know with margins is that you do get what we call collapsed margins. That does not happen with any of the other settings. Borders and paddings never get collapsed, but margins do. So the border is then that line that goes around the edge of the box. Usually we say it's kind of around the edge of the content, even though the padding's kind of in between there. So typically we'll make that some sort of solid line and we'll measure that in pixels. The next thing you see in between there is what we call the padding. So the padding is between the border and the content. It clears out space there. So if you don't have a border in there, it can be a border or background, it can be kind of hard to tell the difference between margin and padding, except that padding never gets collapsed and margin does. However, if you have a border, well, obviously you'll see margin is outside of that border, and padding is inside of that border. Also, if you have a background extends up to the border, so it'll include that padding, whereas whatever's in your margin doesn't have that background. Okay. And finally, you have the content. The content is that box down the center where our actual content appears. The rest is kind of clearing spaces. The padding and the margin are just for clearing white space, and the border is for creating a line. around things, basically. So when we're talking about margin, you can use the margin property to set margin on all four sides at once, or you can use the individual margin properties for each side to set a different margin for each side. So I can either use margin and set all four sides at once, or I can use margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. There are other few shorthands, but those are the main two things that you need to know. So for instance, let's say that I want to declare a few classes here. You'll remember class selectors start with a dot, right? So this is the M4 dot select, the class selector. So I'm saying anything with the class of M4 will get a margin of 1.5 rem. M3 is 1.3, is just, sorry, 1 rem. M2 is 0.5 rem. Remember, rem, EM stands for the current font size. Rem is the root font size of the document. So whatever the font size of the HTML or the body, that's what rem is based on. Now, typically when you're measuring margins, your margins should always be based on EM or rem. Again, EM is the relative, the current font size of what you're putting the margin around, versus a rem is the root, so it's more or less, it's more absolute, right? It doesn't change based on the size of the content you're putting it around. I would generally recommend using rem for your margins, is usually better than EM, but it should always be one of those two, either EM or rem, because your margins really do need to be based on the size of your text. That is important. Similarly with padding, padding you can specify all four sides at once using the padding property, or you can specify the individual sides one by one. Padding should also be measured in EM or rem. Either one works. Again, padding kind of, same reason, padding kind of needs to follow the size of your text for readability purposes. But it can be EM or rem depending on whether you want to go with the current font size or the more absolute rem. I would recommend rem for both the margin and the padding most of the time, but either one is acceptable. Okay. Next up, we want to talk about borders. So you can either write it as the border property, which is a shorthand that sets all of the values that you need for, well, some of the values that you need for borders. So namely, it'll set the width, the style, and the color of the border. Your border width should generally be measured in pixels. And we want to do that because we want to avoid half pixels, which creates generally weird anti-aliasing issues where your borders don't look really good if you have partial pixels. So we generally want to stick with pixels to get whole pixels on our border. So for instance, if I want to create a class here, we're going to create a rule for border black, giving things a black border. I could specify it like this. Here's the width of the border is 1 pix. Solid is the style, so it's just straight up that one color. And then black. So 1 pix solid black will give me a solid black border. Similarly, 3 pix solid red will give me a red border. It is important that those words are in that order. If you change the order of those three things, then your style will not be applied the way you expect it to. So it does need to be width, style, and color in that order. Again, similar to the margin and padding, you can set these properties individually if you need to, and sometimes you only want to change one value. So that happens. So if you just want to set the border width or just the border color, you can do that with those properties. Recognize that if you use the shorthand properties, you are setting all three of those things. If you use the shorthand border property, you can't just set one or two of those things. You have to set all of them at once. Next up is the border radius. Oftentimes we want to have some sort of rounded corners on our borders, and that border radius allows us to do that. Note that you can set the border radius even if you don't have a border. So if you set the border radius without a border, it actually will change the edges where the background are. So if you have a background, it still might be considered, you still might consider setting the background radius to give it rounded corners. The border radius, again, the border radius I would typically recommend setting in EM or REM. REM, I would say, is the preferred, but either one will work. And that tends to be, at least in my experience, it makes more sense for your border radius to be correlated with your padding. So for instance, usually I find that having a border, if I am going to set a border radius, I usually want it to be equal to or less than the padding. That usually creates good behaviors around the edges. Interesting thing to note, with the border radius you can set it to percentages, and so in that case it would be a percentage of the size of the element. So for instance, if you set the border radius to 50%, then you always will get an element that is circular. Then you'll get an element that is circular, as you can see down here, right? So if I just set 0.5 rem, you can see the rounded corners here. If I set it to 50%, then I will get an ellipse. Background property is also relevant and useful. Remember, the background is a shorthand for a lot of other properties. So namely, the background color, the image, the origin, the position, the background size, and the background repeat. I would strongly advise you to spend some time reading up on the documentation for background, because there's quite a few things that you can do with it now, and there are several things that you probably haven't even seen in a textbook before. So there are a lot of new features and things that are worth exploring. So to give some examples here, if I just want to set the background to a solid color, I can do it like so. So I can say background color or background red. That will change all those properties, but it will set the background to a red. Or let's say I want to give it an image, this star PNG. I'm going to tell it I don't want to repeat that image. By default, it will repeat the image vertically and horizontally. So I want to tell us to not repeat at all. So I'm going to say no repeat, and then I'm going to say position it to the origin. The position of it is to the left. So this star will be put to the left of the left of the element, but only appear once. So that may be helpful, so especially for buttons and things like that, where you may want to put an icon as part of the background. The next thing you can do is something like this. So I've got an image, jumbo.jpg. This is an image I'm going to use for, say, a Jumbotron. I don't want it to repeat, so I'm going to start with no repeat. And then the next thing I'm going to specify is center/cover. Now, that's kind of an interesting setup there. The first value there before that slash is what's known as the position, and the second is what's known as the size. So center says place the image in the center of the element, and then cover says scale the image to the point that it fills the entire size of the element. So that means the entire element will be filled. Now, there are two different values for size that you really do need to know about. One is contain and one is cover. Contain will scale it up so that it fits inside of it, but that will mean that there's some empty space either on the horizontal sides, the left or right, or the vertical top and bottom. So you're going to see that if you do contain. Cover, on the other hand, make sure that the whole thing is filled, which means that part of your image will be lost to the top and bottom, or part of the image will be lost to the left and right. And that's usually okay for things like jumbotrons or other things you may want to use as a background. So keep those two in mind. Again, this is something that's really worth doing a little bit more reading on there, because cover and contain are really, really helpful in terms of web design. The next thing you'll see in there is this keyword black. What that says is use this color if there's any space that is visible, where the image is not visible. So if, for instance, the jumbotron, if this image has some transparency, then that black will show through. Also, this means if it doesn't cover the entire space, then black will be visible in those places that it doesn't cover. Or a third kind of place that this comes in is if for whatever reason this image doesn't load, this color will be used in place of the image. So that can be a lot of times if you're setting an image that's supposed to cover the entire size of the element, a background image that's supposed to do that, then it's often good to apply color, a color to kind of fill in some of the gaps. Now you'll notice when I specify these images, I don't just directly specify their paths. I have to first of all put the path name in quotes, but I also have to put it into this URL function, basically. That's required to have files in your CSS, file links. Another thing that's worth noting, these references here, these URLs for your images, these are relative to the folder that your CSS is in. They are not relative to the folder that your HTML file is in. That can be a thing that gets students and people can new developers confused a lot of times, because you think, well, I want to go to images. Well, I'm already in the CSS folder, so I need to go up. I need to go up to the images folder. So I can do that one of two ways. I can either use a slash to go back to the root, or I can start it with // to go up a directory. Either of those two work. I generally try to stick nowadays to these more absolute ones most of the time, because I find that it's just easier to maintain it that way. Okay. Next up is the box sizing property. Okay, so the box sizing property is a really interesting one to know about. And what it does is it changes how the total width and height of an element is calculated. So normally, by default, the browser sets the box sizing for everything in your page is going to be set to content box. Okay. Now, with content box, the width and height of your properties only concern themselves with the content, right? What is inside of the element. So the width and height normally do not include the padding, the border, or the margin, which can lead to a lot of errors when you're trying to size elements on the page, especially if you want the element to be the full width of the page. You can't just set it to 100% oftentimes, because, well, you've got the padding and the border that give you errors in that setting. So, for example, if we're looking at an element here, we've got a box class, and we say, well, let's set the width of it to 350 pixels. Let's set the border to be 10 pixels thick, okay? So I would expect that the element is 350 pixels wide. Well, in reality, it will actually render it as 370 pixels wide. Because remember, the content is 350, add 10 for the left border, add 10 for the right border. Together you get 370. This is the default behavior of sizing in all browsers. This is per the HTML spec. This is usually not what you want, which is part of why Bootstrap goes ahead and changes it to this other mode by default. That's part of what one of the first things that they do in their kind of reboot style sheet. With the border box mode, the width and height of your element includes not just the content, but the padding and the border. It still doesn't include the margin, and that's okay. The margin really isn't part of the element, but now it includes the content and the padding, the content, the padding, and the border. So what that means is if I now have it set to the box sizing and border box, I can now say, well, the width of this element is 350. Let's give it a 10 pixel border again. Well, this time that 10 pixel border is part of the width. Okay, so in this case, the element actually is 350 pixels wide, as we would expect, right? So remember, in this case, the width of the element was 370. Here it's now 350. The other thing that changes, though, the kind of maybe gotcha, is in here. What's changed is the size of the content. So in this first case, the content was 350, even though the element was 370. Here, the content is smaller. So here, the content would be 330 pixels wide. But that's usually okay. It's usually okay to change the size, allow the size of the content to change, because it generally text or other things that can easily wrap and change size. Whereas if you have the outer box, if you have this behavior, very often this will end up breaking your layout because it won't be the size that you expected it to be. This is pretty easy to adapt to, the size of the content changing, but the size of the element in the layout changing is generally a problem. So this one I would highly recommend that you create all your pages with that box sizing. Good news being that if you're using Bootstrap will go ahead and change that for you. Okay, so now that we've talked through the general box model, I want to talk a little bit about Flexbox and how that some of the tools that may be useful there, tools and properties, how to use Flexbox. So first of all, question is, what is Flexbox? Maybe it's been a bit since you've seen it. Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout model. It offers a lot of powerful tools for space distribution and alignment. In fact, a lot of the capabilities that provides aren't found in any of the previous layout models that we had with CSS. And nowadays, Flexbox is really the backbone of building modern responsive websites, web applications. It's really hard to build a good web application without it. It's much easier with. So it's definitely a good thing to really understand. So remember that Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout model. When we're talking about that, however, we always have two axes. So the first axis will refer as the main axis, and then we'll refer to the other as the cross axis. Now, which way those are, whether those are horizontal or vertical, depends on the flex direction property. Okay. So the main axis always runs in the direction in the primary direction, in the flex direction. The cross axis always runs perpendicular to that. So, for instance, if our flex direction is set to row, then the main axis will be horizontal and the cross will be vertical. If our flex direction is column, then the main axis is vertical and the cross is perpendicular. Okay. So everything we do with Flexbox really is going to refer back to these axes, axes. So it's pretty important that you understand what those are. It may take a little bit mulling over in your head to figure out, okay, this is what it is. Main axis is that direction, and then cross is the other. But usually it takes a little bit of working out to kind of figure out which of those it is at the moment. Okay, so to change the flex direction, we have a few different values that we can change the direction to. So first one, the two obvious ones are row and column. Row will give you a horizontal container. Column will give you a vertical container. You can also specify the direction as row reverse or column reverse. So normally with a row, the elements start from the left and go to the right. But if we say row reverse, they start from the right and go to the left. So they're in reverse order. Similarly with column usually goes from the top to bottom, but if you flip that around to column reverse, they'll start from the bottom and go up. So both of those provide you ways to reverse the order of the elements in the container, which can be really helpful. So let's say we have a flex direction of row. It would look like this. You can see the main axis is horizontal. The first item, second item, third item. Okay. Also, if I set the flex direction to column, so you can see here in this case that the items go from the top to the bottom. So we got A, B, and C. But you'll also see in this case that they've been stretched to the full width of the column. Notice that they were not stretched all the way here. At least they don't appear to be. What's actually happening is here they are stretched to the full height, and here they're stretched to the full width. So by default, elements in a Flexbox are stretched to the size of the cross axis. And that's a common gotcha. That's usually the first thing you see once you switch something over to Flexbox. You'll immediately see behavior like this, where things are being stretched to the cross axis. Sometimes that's what you want, sometimes that's not. Okay. So talking about the cross axis, we saw that when we had the flex direction set to row, the main axis was horizontal, and here the cross axis would be vertical. Okay, it's always perpendicular to the other axis. So a few bits of terminology. When we're talking about Flexbox, the area of a document laid out using a Flexbox is called a flex container. Okay, so flex container is what contains our items that we want to be, is what contains the items that are going to be quote unquote flexed. So to create a flex container, we need to set the value of the value of the container's display property to flex. So we'll say display : flex. Now that becomes a flex container. As soon as you do that, all of the direct children of that container become flex items. Worth noting, direct children, what we mean is all of the elements that are directly inside of that element are now flex items. Anything that's further down in the hierarchy doesn't automatically become a flex item. It's only the things that are directly underneath that flex container that become flex items. As with everything in CSS, everything's got some sort of initial value. So for instance, when we're creating a flex container, all of the flex items are going to behave a certain way. So namely, if we have, items are going to, the direction by default is a row. So if we want it to be a column, we have to change that explicitly. But if we want it to just be a row, we technically don't usually have to set the direction. We can just leave it as, hey, it's a flex container. It will automatically be horizontal. Okay. Also worth noting, by default, the items are aligned to the start edge of the main axis. So if it's horizontal, that means it's to the left for us generally, versus if it's a column, that would mean the top. The top would be the start. Items generally don't stretch on the main axis. Items don't stretch on the main axis by default, but they can shrink. They can't get bigger. Flexbox by default won't make them bigger, but it will make them smaller if there's not enough space for everything. On the other side, they will be stretched to fill the full width of their cross axis, which is what I mentioned before. Also, just talking about defaults, flex basis will be set to auto. I think I've got another slide on the flex basis. And flex wrap will default to not wrapping, so you'll only get one line of things. So we're talking about the kind of the basics of Flexbox, at least in a one-dimensional sense. We say that Flexbox is one-dimensional, but that is not entirely true, especially since you've already seen there's a main and a cross. When you're dealing with Flexbox, sometimes you have more items that can fit on a single line. So in that case, we need to set the flex wrap property to wrap. And what that'll allow it to do will say, hey, if there's not enough space, don't try to fit it all in that one line. Split it into multiple lines. Okay. So if there is more than can fit in one line, it'll break it onto multiple lines. But if it all fits, then it will stay on that one line. So concept that's worth talking about at this point is, what does it mean for there to be available space? Okay, because that available space is going to affect both the wrapping as well as some properties that we need to talk about here in a minute. So when we're measuring the available space, we start by making a measurement of each of the flex items, right? So we measure each of the flex items along the main axis. Okay, remember it's the main axis, so that might be, it's usually horizontal that we're talking about, but this could also be vertical. So here we've got 3 elements, right? So if we kind of do the math, we can see, okay, well, A is about 100 pixels wide, B is 100 pixels wide, C is 100 pixels wide. So total, there's about 300 pixels worth of space that they're taking up. Which means that there's 200 pixels of free space, free available space that could be just left unallocated or given to one of these elements. So there's 3 main CSS properties that we need to talk about with what happens with that available space. By default, the flex basis property is set to auto, but it defines, which auto means use whatever the width of the element is as the size of it. But the flex basis can be used to define the normal or expected size of the element. Okay, so how big is it normally? So maybe these are 100 pixels normally. Next up, the flex property says how much of the available space should that item grow to occupy, right? So by default that's set to 0, which means that whatever the available space is just left unoccupied. But if any of these elements are a positive value, then it will be split up between those. So for instance, if I set the flex grow to 1 on all 3 of these, then they'll get an equal share of the leftover 200 pixels. Or if I say, let's just set C to 1, leave the other 2 at 0, well then C will get all of the leftover space. So whatever we set to a positive value will get a proportion of that space. Similarly, shrink says, well, what do I do if there's not enough space, right? So let's say we only have a viewport that contains 200 pixels instead of 500. Well, what do I do to shrink this 300 down into 200? Well, if I've got flex wrap set, then we'll just wrap them. But if I don't have wrap set, then it needs to make them smaller to fit into the space. So by default, this is set to 1, which means everything will scale down, everything will shrink at the same rate. So what that would mean is, let's say, nice round numbers, if this was 150 pixels wide that you had of space, these would go down to 50, 50, and 50. You can change that flex shrink to say, I want to have a bigger share of that, I want to get smaller faster, or I want to not size at all. So for instance, if you set a flex shrink of 0, that item won't get smaller than its basis. Okay, because we always start by measuring all the elements at the basis first to determine if there's extra space or if there's not enough space. So if there's extra space, then we use flex grow. If there's not enough space, then we use flex shrink. Other properties for working with Flexbox include some of the alignment properties. So if you want to align things on the main axis, you use the justify content property. There's a few different possible values for justify content, including flex start, which is the default, which means they'll be aligned to the start of the main axis. You can also say flex end to align them to the end of the main axis, or you can use center to put them all in center, and then space between and space around as well. So space between says make the space between each of the elements the same, take all the white space, divide it up evenly. Or you can say space around will also reserve some space for the edges here. So you can see with space between, there's no space on the edge, left and the right, but with space around, there's some extra space here, some extra space here, and namely the extra space here and there is half of one of these spaces. Okay. If you want to align things on the cross axis, we use the align items property, and that has a few different values: stretch, flex start, flex end, center, or baseline. Most of those elements are kind of similar to what you saw with the main axis, except for stretch and baseline. So stretch says take it to expand the full width of the full size of the cross axis, which is the default. Or baseline says it's similar to center, but it will center it so that the lines of text line up. So if this element has a size of 40 and this element has a size of 30, it'll line it up so that the text is at the same level. Next up, if you have wrapping set, specifically this only works if you have more than one line of content. This only does anything for that. Align content is what you're going to use when you have more than one line, and so it's going to kind of space those out. So it can be a few different values. It can be stretch, it can be start, flex end, center, space between, or space around, and those work basically the same way as the ones do for justify content for the main axis, except that it's spacing these groups, these lines of elements between each other. By default, it's stretch, which means that all the lines will fill up the full height of the element. But let's say you just want them to be in, just take up the upper section of the container or the bottom section or center. That's where you might use start, end, or center. Of the alignment properties, these first two are very commonly used. I would say align content is much more rare. simply because it's much less frequently that we align things with wrapping than when we align things without wrapping. Okay. A few things worth noting, because of, remember we have justify content aligns things along the main axis, as well as align items, align things on the horizontal axis, so the cross axis. I can actually use these alignment properties to align any element I want. So let's say I start with a div and I make it a flex container. I give it a minimum height of 600, so it has to be at least 600 pixels tall. I can then say, okay, within this container, I want to center this content. If I apply justify content center, align item center, it will now be centered in the middle. And the really nice thing about this is this kind of combination, this setup, actually works to center anything, which is amazing because prior to Flexbox, that actually was a really hard thing to do. Centering things both vertically and horizontally was actually a really, really hard problem to solve. And oftentimes centering things vertically was one that was basically uncrackable. You couldn't do it in any sort of responsive way, but now you can. So definitely keep those alignment properties in your back pocket, because that's the way we align things, align blocks, both vertically and horizontally now, is you use a Flexbox, a flex container. Okay. To read more about Flexbox and all the individual properties, all the different settings that you can set them to, and what their defaults are, I would strongly recommend reading this article, A Complete Guide to Flexbox. It's got some really thorough explanations, as well as some really great images, pictures to help explain the content. This is actually one of your reading assignments on Perusal, so expect to find that in one of those assignments. Next up, let's talk about selectors. So we kind of touched on them previously. I hope you remember most of this content. But anytime we're working with CSS, we always need to tell it, well, what thing do I want to apply that style to, right? And we use selectors for that. Whether we're working with an embedded style sheet or an inline or our external style sheet, we always need to use these selectors to say what kind of things to select. So the first, most maybe simplest kind of selector you can use is the universal selector. Okay, the universal selector is just a star. It says select everything, with some minor exceptions, namely it doesn't select the before and after pseudo elements, but otherwise it selects everything. So star you can kind of use if I want to say I want to apply styling to everything on the page. Star is a good use for that. However, you do want to limit, because they do want to limit how much you use the star, because it is a little bit performance sensitive. It can be a little bit slow because you're saying apply this to everything. So you can use it, but use it sparingly. The next thing you'll see is the type selector. And so the type selector, my slide name is wrong. This should be the universal selector. So the universal selector matches anything of any type. So for instance here, if I say star, so I'm going to apply it to everything, I want to change the color to green, that would change all three of these elements to green. So here we've got this H1, this H2, and the paragraph. All three of those would be green because I told it to apply to everything. I can also use type selectors to say I only want to match elements with this name. So for instance here I'm going to say I want to change the style of all the spans. So the spans are all going to have a background of sky blue. It looks something like this. So I'm going to say, okay, this is a span, so it gets the blue background. This is another span, it gets the blue background, but the P in the middle doesn't. So every element that has that particular type of tag. Next up is you've got the class selectors. Class selector says I only want to apply the style to elements that have this class property. So for instance, here we've got 4 paragraphs. The first one has this class as red. We've got class as red, yellow background. Class as red, fancy. So what we can see is the first 3 all have that red class. The second and then the third both actually have 2 classes. So they'll get the styling from both of those classes. So if we look at red, well, red makes it red. Red makes the text red. So we can see we've got red text, red text, red text. Okay, so your class selector always starts with a dot. You remember your type selector doesn't have any sort of prefix, but your class selector has a prefix of a period. So here we're going to say, so red is color red. You can see yellow background. Okay, we've got background yellow. And then finally for this third one, and you can see that the font weight is being changed to bold, and you can see there's some sort of text shadow appearing as well, which you can see kind of that blue shadow behind it. So that's coming from both of those 2 classes, right? It's getting the red text as well as the bold and shadow because it has both of those classes. Now, in that you can see that I can apply the same class to multiple things in the web page, and it doesn't matter what type of tag it is, I can always apply that class. And both of those things are very useful in the fact that I can reuse the class multiple times on the page, but I also can have it be something that's maybe I have the same class applied to different tags. So one of the things so with that being said, I would say that most things, if you're going to use some sort of CSS rules, generally you want most of your selectors to be class selectors. This should be the most common type of selector that you have, because eventually you're going to find, oh, there's more than one thing that needs to have this styling. It's pretty much a guaranteed. For most things, if you want to apply styling, you're probably going to apply it to more than just one element. Also, you're typically going to find that, hey, I don't necessarily, it's often not a great idea to style based on the tag, because you may have 2 different things that need to be styled the same way, even though they're different tags. So by using class selectors largely, you don't kind of box yourself into a situation where you have the problem that, oh, I need 2 of these things, or maybe I need to have one that's with this tag and one with that tag. So usually you'll want to use those class selectors the most, although all of them you're going to use a little. Next up for the basic selectors, and this is the last one of the basic selectors, is the ID selector. So we saw you can apply a class. You can also apply an ID to any tag, like so. So ID is equal to identified here. That name can be whatever I want it to be, but the name of the property has to be ID. That value can be anything. It's worth noting that IDs need to be unique throughout the entire document. So I can't use the same ID multiple times. So for instance, I can't have both of these divs have an ID of red. IDs must be unique. And if you violate that rule where 2 things have the same ID, generally your browser will take the first thing that has that ID and treat it as the thing with that ID, and treat all the rest as not having that ID. generally speaking. So this is kind of reserved for, hey, this is a specific element within the page, not a group of elements, which is what the class represents. The other thing to know is your element can only have one ID, right? So back here we can separate it with spaces and have more than one class. You can't have more than one ID for a particular element. Okay, so if I want to create a selector for an ID, rather than starting with a dot, I start it with this hash. So hash identified, give it a background color of blue. So type selectors don't have any sort of prefix. They're just the name of the tag. Dot is class starts with a dot, and your ID selectors start with a hash. Okay. You can also use, you can also use attribute selectors to select elements in your page, which is a relatively newer feature of CSS. So in this case, for instance, I'm saying, well, let's make all of the links, we'll make all regular links, we'll make them color blue. Any link, we'll just, here we've got a regular type selector, okay? Next up, I have one form of an attribute selector. So this one says, if it has a title property, then let's change the background color to gold. So we look down here, we see, okay, the second link has a title property, so that one will be gold. It'll have a gold background. None of the others will because they don't have a title property. If I specify it this way without any sort of equals, it just says, hey, it has to have that property. I don't care what the value is, but it needs to at least have that property. Next rule we have here, we say href is equal to hbs example.org. So if the href property has exactly this value, then I'll change the color of the link to green. So we can see here that would apply to that third link because it has exactly that href property. Similarly, I might say, okay, well, let's take the ones that have an href that starts with hash, which would be most, if you're linking within a page, you're going to start that with hash. So this is linked to, rather than taking you to another page, remember links of this type take you to that particular point in the page. So it's going to take you to wherever the ID internal element is. The element with the ID of internal. So here we're saying any link, any anchor tag that has an href property which starts with hash, then we're going to give that red. So what that means is we have a blue link, a link with a gold background, a green link, and a red link here. Pseudo selectors are also another kind of selector, and they select based on the state of an element, okay, based on special states of those elements. So for instance, the hover pseudo class applies when the mouse pointer is over it, when the mouse hovers over it. So a few pseudo classes that we use pretty often. First one being hover. Hover if your mouse is over it. Focus if that element, which is the element that currently has focus. Focus within, which is a newer one, says either that element has focus or something inside of it, or some descendant of it has focus. Both of these things can be very helpful, especially if you're trying to build menus, drop-down menus, or tiered drop-down menus to be more specific. Next up is the first child. So first child says I want the first element in that group. So if you've got a collection of list items, perhaps in an unordered list, I could say UL first child, and that would be the first child. That would be the first UL in the list. first li in the list. I could say li first child, and that would be the first element. Similar, if I want the last element, I can do last child. I can also use nth child, or in a variety of different ways. So I can get the odd elements, so 1, 3, 5, etc., or I could get the even elements numbered 2, 4, 6, etc. Pseudo-elements are kind of virtual fake elements. They don't necessarily exist as real elements in the HTML, but we can still refer to them as actual elements. So for instance, if I want to say I want the first line in a paragraph, I could say, well, give me : first line. You'll notice that the pseudo classes start with a single colon, versus the pseudo elements start with 2 colons. So : first line refers to the first line of text in a block. First letter is the first letter within that block. And it's usually, we say it's the first letter within the first line. And there's also these other two pseudo elements which come up actually quite a bit. You've got the before and you've got the after. The before element, pseudo element, kind of creates this virtual element that appears just before the element that you select, and after is kind of just after. Now, it is worth noting, if you want to use before or after, you do have to set the content property. So the content property says what character or characters do you want to actually put there where that pseudo element is going to go. If you don't set the content property, then the before or after don't exist. Because what you're doing is you're saying, content, here's the content I want to be there, and then the rest of the properties are styling that content. So for instance, if you wanted to put quotes, double quotes around a paragraph of text, you would set the before, the content would be the beginning quote, and the after would be the ending quote. So now we've talked about the basics. You can now combine those selectors into a combination, or into more complicated, more specific selectors. So a few different combinators that you can use. The most common one that you'll see people use is just a space in between there. That just says I want element B that is somewhere inside of, somewhere a descendant of A. It doesn't have to be directly underneath it. It could be anywhere underneath it. Versus the child selector, if I say A arrow B, I'm saying I want something that's exactly just one level below A. So oftentimes you'll see things like UL arrow LI, so I want the LIs that are directly inside the unordered list, rather than any of the LIs that may be deeper if I have some nested lists. There's also the sibling selectors, which we don't use very often but do come up sometimes. The adjacent sibling says, well, just give me the sibling that's immediately after the element that I'm interested in. So if you think of this, your CSS is kind of a tree, kind of going from the top to the bottom. You think of the parents at the top and the children at the bottom. Siblings are elements that are at the same level. So siblings are going to be inside of the same container. So if I say, what's the next element, is kind of how you can think of it. The next element in the container, that would be your adjacent sibling. So I can use that plus to say I want, well, these elements that are after the element in question, after the element A. I can also use the general sibling selector. So here we've got a tilde b, and that says not just the one that's immediately next, but all the ones that are after. All the b's that are after a up until either the end of the container or I see another a. Also, I can group selectors together, so I can take two selectors that I have. They might be combinations like this, or combinations of all the previous ones. But I can say, well, let's put a comma in between. Then I'm saying anything that's A or B. So, for instance, I might say, well, let's style all the unordered lists and the ordered lists. So I might say OL, comma UL. Or maybe I want to style all the heading tags, so I might say H1, comma H2, comma H3, etc. And that would apply the same styling to all of those. Next up, we want to talk about colors and how do we apply colors to text, to the background, as well as to borders. There's a few different ways in CSS to specify colors. First, we can specify them by name. So for instance, I can say lime, that will give me a color, or I can specify it with a 3-digit hex code. Looks like this, so hash 0f0, or I could specify it as a 6-digit hex code. You can see a hash and 6 digits. These are actually all the same color. Another way I can specify colors is using RGBA like this, RGBA. If I'm doing this, I'm going to say, okay, R is here, a number from 0 to 255. B, so I've got red, green, and blue. And then the third number is what we refer to as the alpha channel, which refers to the opacity. So 0 here would mean that it's fully transparent. 1 means it's fully opaque. Similarly, we can specify HSL or HSLA values, those being with or without the alpha channel. So here I can say the hue is 120 degrees, the saturation is 100%, and the L is 50%, which I forget what the L is. So if I'm specifying colors in terms of keywords, there's a bunch of different keywords I can pick from. The most common ones here, you can see the list: aqua, black, blue. There are actually much more that have been added in CSS3. So these are the kind of the values, the constants that were there originally, but there actually are quite a few more if you go look at the documentation. So if I'm specifying colors in RGB, remember there's a few different ways for me to do that. So the first way I can do is with the 3-digit hex code. First digit being the red, second one being the green, and then the third one being the blue. In this case, all those digits are in the range from 0 to F, namely they're hexadecimal. In this case, A represents 10, B is 11, etc., going all the way up to F. F represents 15. So it's base 16 is how you're specifying this. I can also specify it as a 6-digit code. So here they go from 00 to FF, the groupings. The shorthand, the 3-digit shorthand, is basically just duplicating those digits. So if I say ABC, that's short for AA, BB, CC. It's just doubling up the digit. Okay. RGB, I can also specify it with, instead of a hash like this, I can specify RGB as the beginning. And then I'm going to specify the red, green, and the blue channels. But notice in here, these first two methods, I'm using hexadecimal. This version, I'm using decimal. So here it goes from 0 to 255, which actually in hexadecimal, 0 to FF is 0 to 255, as it turns out. So I'm specifying those values either in hex or in decimal. More often than not, the one that most designers use, most developers use, is the second form. the six-digit form, because it's the easiest form to share with other developers, copy and paste from other online tools and kind of move around. So this is what you'll see the most common, but the other ones do exist. You can also specify that RGB color as RGBA, and this is the only version that lets you specify the alpha channel. Okay, so here I can specify the alpha channel. It goes from 0 to 1. So remember, 0 is transparent, 1 is fully opaque. And anywhere in between there is going to be kind of partially opaque. So if I put it as like 0.5, that means it's 50% opaque. There we go. So another way I can specify colors, I can specify as the RGB as the channels, or as those primary colors, or I can specify using hue, saturation, and lightness. And this is kind of a very different way to specify colors, and if you're not familiar with it, it may be kind of hard to visualize. But the way to think about it is think about it using a color wheel. So the first measure, the hue, is a number from 0 to 359 degrees. You're going around kind of this color wheel, and that changes the actual color or hue that you're starting with, the primary hue. Each of the different primary colors are separated every 120 degrees, every third of the circle. So red is at 0. If you go around, then you get to green at 120 degrees, and then you get to blue at 240 degrees. So you can see that with these first three examples. You see the hue value is 0, 120, and 240. That gets you red, green, and blue. The next value is the saturation, which is kind of how pure the color is. So if we have 100%, then the color is 100% pure. You get that pure color, no other colors intermixed. Whereas if you go to 0, you're intermixing more and more of the other channels. So let's say you start with a pure red. If you become more and more saturated, then you're going to be adding some of the other colors. So 0 would be kind of a gray. Lightness also changes how dark or light the color is. So by default, you start at 50%, which is kind of the normal. If you push it up to if you push it down to 0, you're going to get black. If you push it all the way up to all the way up to 100%, you're going to get white. So that's where you can see on both of these, regardless of what the actual hue is, if you change it to 100% in terms of the lightness, you get white. If you change it to 0%, you get black. And you might ask, well, why should I use these colors instead of using RGB? Because RGB is pretty easy to figure out. The advantage of using HSL is a lot easier as a designer, whether it be a graphic designer or web designer, to come in and tweak the color slightly. So you can make it just a little bit lighter, just a little bit darker. It's a lot easier to kind of make variants in the color, or to say, well, I want to animate the hue and make it just go all chroma strobe and just go around the circle. Well, you can do those kind of things a lot easier when you're looking at the color in terms of HSL. So this one's getting a little bit more traction. It's still not used all that much with web development, but can be a lot easier if you're trying to get into the web design space. Okay. So let's talk about the color property. So the color property, we can set it with any of those values we just talked about, and it changes the text color. Okay, changes the color of your text. I know it doesn't say text in the name, but that's what color does. Color changes the color of your text. So I can say, for instance, here all the H1 tags, maybe they get a green. I'm going to set the H2s to some other shade here, which turns out to be a green. And then finally we'll set the H3s with another color, which also, if I remember right, is a green. So we're making all three of these headers green, just with specifying the color in a different way. Okay. We can also set the background color of an element. Remember we talked about the background. You can use a shorthand to set all of those properties, and all of those properties are definitely something you may want to set if you have actually an image there. But if you just want to change the color, you can change that with the background color property. Similarly, we talked about borders earlier. If you just want to change the border color, you can change that with the border color property. But if you need to set all three things, obviously use the border property. All I want you to notice here is that color, background color, and border color, all three of these can use those same kind of values. Okay. Fonts. Let's talk a little bit about fonts and how do we style text, because if you're creating a website, you're going to have text on it. So the first property we want to talk about briefly is the font family property. The font family changes what kind of typeface, what font you're seeing. If you want to change the font for the entire page, you change it on the HTML element. So for instance here, I'm setting my selector is just the HTML tag, so this will set the font for the entire page, and then it will be inherited from there. It's worth noting that a lot of these properties when we're working with fonts are inherited, so not only will the element that you select get it, but anything inside of that element will also get that value. So here we're going to say let's set the font family to one of these three: Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. The way this works, it'll say, okay, if I have the Arial font, then I'm going to use it. If I don't have the Arial font, I'm going to use Helvetica instead. And then if I don't have either of those, I'm going to fall back to the default sans serif font. So there's a few of these fallback groups that you can use for when your specific font isn't available. So those are serif, sans serif, and monospace. Serif meaning it has the little serifs that you might see on, like, for instance, Times New Roman, or sans serif means it doesn't have those serifs that you might see on Arial. Monospace is something we typically reserve for showing code. Monospace means that all of the characters have the same width, which is really useful for aligning code, but isn't necessarily used for just normal text often. So here we're going to say that the HTML, the default font for the page, the default font family for the page is going to be Arial or sans serif if you can't find one of those two. Here I'm saying the headers H1, H2, and H3, I'm setting these to a serif font. So I'm saying, okay, well, set it to Times if Times exists. If Times doesn't exist, then specify as Times New Roman. If your font name has spaces in it, you'll need to remember to put quotes around it. And then finally, if neither of those fonts exist, fall back to the generic serif font. Next, you'll see here, well, we want to style code, right? So we've got a code tag. I want text in that to be typically monospaced. So I might set the font family to Consolas, Courier, or Monospace. So if Consola is available, it will take that one. If it's not available, use Courier, and then use Monospace instead. So you can specify a series of fallbacks for the font family. And you always want to make sure that you specify them in the right order, because it will use the first one that it finds. And you want to make sure that you have one of these generic fallbacks always at the end, because otherwise it will fall back to the browser default, which often means falling back to Times New Romans. Times New Roman, or whatever was inherited from a previous element. Okay. Defined fonts to use on your website. One tool that you can use is Google Fonts. They've got a lot of fonts that are freely available, and they're fairly easy to set up. You'll go to fonts.google.com. You'll see a page like this with a variety of fonts that are all available and free to use. Once you pick one of them, you can either download it and just use it directly using the font, well, I say directly, but I mean using font face sort of thing. But typically when I bring that in, I'll use the style sheet thing and have them let Google host it themselves. So if I want to bring in, for instance, here I'm bringing in Roboto, that's the one I had picked. I'm going to go select it, add to my cart, and then you're going to get this kind of setup here. Now, I probably should just go ahead and go to the website, and let's walk through quickly how to get to that. Okay, so here I've got Roboto here. There's a little icon up here. You can say view your selected family. When I'm looking at a font, it'll give me all these different styles. So maybe I say I want the regular form of it, regular 400 width, 400 weight. So I maybe want the regular version of it as well as the bold version. Okay. So I can add those in here to kind of my shopping cart. And then when I go over to the embed tag, it will give me this code. So if I want to use this Roboto in those two different styles, the regular and the bold on my website, I just take this link tag and I add it to my HTML. And then I can use these fonts anywhere in my page. You can kind of see what you need to specify in the CSS. I need to say font family, Roboto, or fallback to sans serif. So it gives you a suggested fallback category. I've found that sometimes these fallback categories aren't correct. So, pay attention to what kind of font it is and what would be a more sensical fallback, because sometimes the fallbacks don't really make a lot of sense. So that's that. Okay. So Google Fonts can be really helpful for finding fonts on the internet that you can use in your own application. Next up is the font size property. The font size property changes how big the font is, changes the size of your text. As a general rule of thumb, you want to set your font size in either EM or REM. Remember, EM is relative to the current font size, so 1 EM represents the current font size. 1 REM is that root font size. So you generally want to set your font size in one of those two. Font size, just like font family, is inherited to child elements. I will caution you, don't set your font sizes in pixels because that does not work well for it doesn't scale responsively with different screen sizes. So you want to set it in EM and REM so the user can increase and decrease the font size as they need to make it more readable and such. So please make sure that you're setting your font sizes in EMs or in REMs. So for instance here, you can kind of see an example. We've set the H1s to 2 rems, so they're going to be twice the normal size. We've set the H2s to 1.75, so they're going to be just a little bit smaller than our H1s, but still bigger than the regular font size. Next up we have the H3s, 1.5 rem, so they're still going to be bigger than our regular font size, smaller than our H2s. So you can kind of see it descending in size until finally we get down to our paragraph. We just say, well, that's 1 rem. That's our regular font size. You may also want to set the line height. So remember, the font size is how big the text is. The line height is how tall a line of text is. And that line height is set as a unisless multiple, and it's a multiple of the font size. So for instance here I'm setting the line height as 2, which means it will be twice the font size. Okay, so if the font size is, say, 16 pixels, then this would be 32 pixels tall. the line. And what that does is it creates white space underneath the line and on top of the line. If you've ever had to do double-spaced papers or essays for English class, that would be what this is. We're talking about double spacing as line height too. So you can see usually we want more, generally speaking, we want a bigger line height the bigger the font size is. So if I'm going to set the font size to 2, I might also set the line height to 2, and then kind of going down from there. So I'm going to start with a line height of 2 for the H1s, 1.75, 1.5, and then finally 1.2 for the paragraphs. So that, remember, line height creates a little space above, some white space above and beneath lines. Most commonly where you'll see that is in between lines, where you'll see that show up. But it's technically above and below. We can also set the font weight property to change how bold the text is. You can either use keywords, normal, bold, bolder, light, or lighter. You can use those keywords, or you can specify as a number going from 100 to 900. 100 being the lightest and 900 being the boldest. If I remember right, normal sits around 400. 400 is about normal. Bold is generally considered like 700. The font weight is also inherited to child elements, just like the font size and the other ones that we were talking about previously. Do be forewarned that on some fonts, the difference between normal font weight and font weight bold isn't really much, and I have seen cases where it's not noticeable. So you may consider, setting things to bold or to make sure it's actually visible that there is a difference, because sometimes the difference between bold and normal is not that much. The text decoration property is going to change the appearance of your text, and namely it changes the appearance of decorative lines on your text. It can be used, oftentimes we'll use it with links to show that link is interactable. So for instance, I might say, okay, my links have a text decoration of none. They don't have any lines on them. And then I might say, if you either hover or focus that link, then we're going to show a text decoration underline. So you'd see, oh, well, that is interactable. Similarly, I might say, well, maybe I want to strike through some text. You would say text decoration line through. And that would put a strike through in that text. So finally, to round this out, I think this lecture has been a little bit long. We talked about how to apply styles with inline as inline styles. We talked about how to apply them as embedded style sheets or external style sheets. Remember that typically applying things as inline styles is not a good idea. And one of those reasons is that it doesn't really work well with responsive design. Next, we talked about the box model, and namely the main parts of that box model are the margin, the border, the padding, and the content. Okay, and we talked about how the box sizing property affects how the width and height calculations are worked out. Next, we talked about Flexbox and how to use that to lay out elements on your page. We talked about Flexbox, flex containers, and flex items. We talked about some of the alignment properties. We talked about how to use grow and shrink. We also talked about, what is this main axis and the cross axis that we always talk about with Flexbox. And we talked about a few different kinds of selectors. We talked about the type selector, the class selector, the ID selector. Those are the main three that you'll want to remember. There are some other ones that we mentioned, but those are the main three that you really need to remember. Also with relational selectors, descendant and direct descendant, those are the ones you really want to review. Remember, direct descendant, it means it has to be a direct child of that element, and that's with the arrow. versus descendant is without the arrow and you're saying it's anywhere underneath. It's just a space between the two selectors. And we also talked about how to use colors. We can specify colors, remember, with hex values or RGB decimal values or as HSL. Any of those three values or three methods of setting it are possible. And you also set colors via names. And then finally, we talked about a few of the different font properties to style text. All right, that's it for today. There are a bunch of links here at the end to go and read some more about some of the things we talked about, to read deeper on CSS and refresh some of the stuff that you may need to know. But that's it for this lecture.